Beyond the gates, spoilers teased that the glitter that once held them together had a seam that nobody saw until it snapped. The announcement arrived on a grey Monday. Sharp and brief: Chelsea would be stepping away from the public eye, pulling back from editorials and campaigns, suspending the partnership that had become a brand in itself. The statement read like a retreat: gratitude for years of collaboration, an insistence on privacy, a promise to step away to heal. Where other stars might frame a hiatus as strategic, Chelsea's words carried an undercurrent of alarm. For anyone who had watched her rise the billboard mornings, the magazine covers whose glossy teeth opened doors, the message landed like a stone dropped into a still pond. Circles of ripples spread out and the industry began leaning forward, angling for what would remain when she was gone. Kat held the printed statement in the back of a taxi, rain feathering the glass. She could feel the heat rise in the way that meant crying might be close. It was anger and grief braided together. The partnership had been a pact, not merely corporate but intimate. Years of shoots, last-minute flights, shared dressing rooms and jokes that started at 2 a.m. and were still funny at 6. They had promised each other a mutual lift that each would carry the other when the runway got shaky. Chelsea's hiatus felt like an abandonment in that sacred, small way, a pivot away from a shared dream that Kat had invested everything in emotionally, creatively, practically. Yet she had seen the rawness in Chelsea's hands when she returned from the hospital. She had seen the blank at the center of Chelsea's laugh. Sometimes loyalty is something you hold up like a mirror for someone to see themselves in. Other times it's an inability to look away because what you might see is how small you were in someone else's life. The kidnapping itself had been merciless in how it replayed within the press. Tabloids recycled footage from surveillance, a pair of feet hurrying beneath a marquee, a long coat slipping into unlit corridors. 100 commentators parsed motives and vulnerabilities. People who had never met Chelsea wrote top heads about the fragility of fame. The truth, the parts that mattered to Chelsea, were quieter and uglier. She arrived at the press conference with the careful composure of someone staging an exit. Her voice flaked at the edges, but the sentences were assembled as if the voice was a suit she unbuttoned and buttoned to keep herself from being recognized by emotion. Allison, the person convicted for the abduction and for the psychological torment that followed, became the grotesque center of every story. The courts moved with the deliberate pace of institutions, and Allison's charges were read aloud with that clean, dispassionate cadence that strips flesh from crime and leaves a skeletal structure for the headlines. The law reached out with a gavel and a formula and, in the end, Allison would be punished. But punishment on paper does not retrace the hour a scream became ordinary or the way light from a motel window slatted across a sleeping face and turned it into a new geography. Chelsea's experience of Allison was recursive. Every detail of the abduction had been a demonstration of power over intimacy, a cruel curriculum in humiliation. Allison's actions were not only violent in the physical sense, they rewired what Chelsea expected from anyone who smiled her way. Afterward, Chelsea kept hearing the melody of Allison's voice in the wrong places, in elevators, through the grain of televised interviews. It lodged as something almost fascinated, repulsed, a magnet of attention she could not look away from. It became less an image of a person and more a linguistic stain. The way someone pronounces a name can map the blood to the bone. Dani came into the story like a steady tide. She was the slow, dependable gravity that kept Chelsea on an axis even when everything else rolled. Dani wanted small comforts, a bowl of soup at 3 in the morning, shoes that fit, a steady hand on the small of Chelsea's back as she walked into therapy rooms she did not want to enter. When ambition looked like a child learning to run, she had watched headlines carry her daughter across continents and had seen that same light get scraped by the press. Now she watched that light go dark and did everything a mother could think to do practical work, packing Chelsea's favorite sweaters, canceling public appearances, talking to lawyers, arranging for a trusted physician. But her support also had a spiritual kind, a permission to not perform. Dani made space and kept that boundary clear. In private, she said the things that the world could not publish, that it was okay to break, to bleed, to take time without apology. It was revolutionary advice in that industry, A soft rebellion that required no meetings or memo. Kat's sadness did not manifest only in public gestures. It insinuated itself into the logistics of her days. She had bookings waiting like an unapologetic calendar that refused to acknowledge her grief. Cruella-esque designers called and made pitches that painted their offers as moral obligations for the culture. Tabloids sent gentle pings that read as if they had concern. Her agent, a human storm of sentences and action items, began sending requests with the faith of someone who believed momentum could replace meaning. "You can take Chelsea's hiatus and still honor her," the agent said, as if honor could be itemized into a brand kit. "You can make an homage," they suggested, "a tribute show we'll put proceeds toward survivor services." Every message landed like an offering in a church with an open vault. Each one demanded from Kat an answer to a question she had not wanted to be asked. What is the currency of loyalty in a profession that trades on exposure? Kat went to work, because to stop would be to be swallowed by time. Work was the only thing that let her move like a machine through the fog. Photography sets became shrines of what had been, an old director's calm voice, mirrors reflecting chrome and bone, mannequins that wore clothes like second skins. She modeled the clothing, but her eyes kept looking for the person to her right, for the quick exchange that had become their code. In between sets, she would sit in a corner and look at the phone until it buzzed with messages from Chelsea, short, rarely personal, the kind that were carefully edited. "I'm okay. I'm resting. Please don't make apologies." Those messages were elastic. They stretched and sometimes they snapped. Kat kept them anyway, folding them into the pocket of an old sweater as if a fabric could hold back the tide. Chelsea's need to withdraw felt like survival logic. She had tasted the rawness of being at someone else's absolute, that moment when a stranger believes they own something of you. Kidnapped in a way that stripped away any staged glamour, forced into a private theater where Allison narrated the world according to her own deranged script. Chelsea had learned the dangerous lesson that exposure meant vulnerability and that the audience could become predator. The idea of returning to magazine shoots, to liaisons with stylists and nameless men whose opinions shaped her career, felt suddenly like a betrayal of the self that required recuperation. She did not want the adrenaline of cameras. She wanted quiet. But quiet in public life is expensive and logistically complicated. It meant canceling multi-million-dollar contracts. It meant having executives question financial responsibility. It meant signing non-disclosure agreements and telling half-truths. Despite the public framing that suggested a glamorous sabbatical, the truth of Chelsea's days was less cinematic. She went to therapy. The rooms smelled faintly of lemon and paper. Chelsea would sit under soft lights and try to translate memory into language. Therapy asked for an inventory of sensations, where in the body grief lodged, which thoughts came with a physical memory of touch. The therapist, patient, almost bureaucratic in kindness, helped Chelsea map the landscape of triggers. There were sensory details that acted like landmines. The smell of cigarette smoke might derail a calm hour. A certain laugh would send her back to the cold tile of a motel bath. Each session required a kind of courage that did not get applause. It was repetitive work, naming, feeling, naming again. As therapy progressed, Chelsea learned to create small rituals to reclaim mundane territory: a candle she could light that signaled safety, a precise playlist for morning walks, a way of locking the door that made her feel like she was at the center of an available fortress. The legal proceedings against Allison ground forward with the sluggish momentum of systems not designed around human fragility. Prosecutors presented evidence, surveillance footage, witnesses who testified about strange sightings, phone records. Allison's motives were thinly described in legal language: obsession, trespass, coercion, and yet the testimony given by Chelsea altered the sound of those words. When she testified, she did not dramatize. She described concrete things, the way a screen had shown her a video of her own face, a voice reciting slurs she had never heard that claimed to know her secrets. The feeling of being paraded in a space without windows. Her testimony was surgical and personal. People watched her: critics, fans, strangers consider her with curiosity. The court gave Allison a sentence that satisfied the ledger but did not reroute the memory from Chelsea's bones. Justice was a metric, Healing remained a private project that could not be legislated. As the trial unfurled, the public's appetite for explanation turned to another hunger: gossip. There were sudden insinuations that Chelsea had changed in a way that made her darker, that she had become unpredictable. Opportunistic commentators pronounced transformations as character flaws. The narrative was binary: either she had been irreparably damaged by trauma or she was staging a dramatic image for attention. Both narratives simplified the complex reality into a headline. For Chelsea, whose inner weather shifted like the seasons, such reductive readings were a salt in a still wound. Meanwhile, Kat navigated offers and rejections like a ship through a narrow strait. The industry saw an opportunity. With Chelsea absent, space had opened. Agents presented roles like Temptations lead campaign in Milan. One email read, "Front the charity gala." Another suggested there was money and validation and the fulfillment of dreams that had driven Kat since she first wanted to be seen. Yet behind each invitation was the question of fidelity, to her friend, to their history, to the unspoken covenant of solidarity. The choice was not a singular moral equation, it was a complex geometry of need, impulse, and aspiration. Kat argued with herself in the quiet hours. Maybe taking the work would be honoring Chelsea by keeping the brand alive, maybe it would be abandoning a partner who had once pledged the same. Danny, who lived in a different rhythm than the industry's pulse, insisted on simplicity. She told Chelsea plainly, with a mother's impatience, "Heal. Not for anyone else but yourself. And don't listen to people who think they can measure your scars." But Danny also had an eye on the practical. Money had to be secured. The house needed vigilance, and the specter of a public life meant someone would always want to know more. She arranged for a private security detail, for discreet relocation, for a temporary retreat in a place that smelled of pine and soil rather than perfume and flash bulbs. It was not an escape from difficulty, but an environment where triggers were predictable and where Chelsea could, carefully, begin to reconstitute herself. Outside of Chelsea's orbit, other personal dramas simmered. Nicole's divorce from Ted escalated into a public, ugly negotiation. Where Chelsea's struggle was with the public's gaze, Nicole's battle was with custody of a life she had built with the wrong person. Ted revealed himself in the negotiations as someone whose affection had always attached to property lines and ledger entries. He mentioned the house, a sunlit structure with a high eaves porch, in the tone of a man evaluating an acquisition. Nicole watched him say the word, watching his face rearrange itself into an expression she had seen before when he calculated a purchase. He requested half, then more. His lawyer's emails were clinical and cold. Nicole, exhausted by the emotional weather and terrified of drawn-out litigation that would keep both of them tethered to each other for months, made the pragmatic choice: she would sign over the house, accept an additional financial settlement if needed, just to finalize the divorce. The decision cost her an old geography of memory, but it offered a route out from the daily harassment she'd endured: calls from strangers, a nagging presence of someone named Leslie who was more than rumor and less than a full identity. She wanted freedom, not vindication. So she traded place for speed. That exchange with Ted revealed the brittle scaffolding around him. He grew defensive and entitled as he enumerated possessions. He had always been a man for whom life could be balanced on a spreadsheet, affection measured, time apportioned, loyalty priced. Nicole's willingness to sign away the house angered him because it upended his calculation of dominance. She was refusing to remain hostage to the drama. "You think you can erase us?" he demanded at one meeting, the office air cold with legal language. Nicole looked tired enough to have outlived capital and rage. She said, simply, "I want to move on." Her signature would be there the next morning. The world churned on. Chelsea's social media accounts became a ghost town of cobwebs. Press releases sprouted like a fungal growth, each trying to frame her silence as something marketable: reinvention. The private star, the industry, unsurprisingly, found ways to repackage absence as possibility. But the circle that mattered, the friends who had been with her through audition rooms and airline delays, the family who kept the home fires lit, were watching a different thing: a person retreating to heal and someone else who had to decide whether to take on the dream with both hands, alone. Kat's internal conflict grew teeth. One evening, On a shoot in a warehouse converted into a minimalist theater, a producer approached her. He had eyes that measured potential in the currency of upcoming campaigns. "We want you to front an entire line," he said. He drew a breath that suggested this was a moral offering. "It would be in homage to your collaboration. We'd donate a portion. It would keep the conversation alive." Kat could see the arithmetic of the idea: spectacle, charity, brand continuity. She could also see the hollow where Chelsea used to stand. The camera lights glowed like twin moons. She thought of Chelsea's quiet voice telling her to be brave in different ways, of Danny's $10 a day advice to breathe. She thought of the way Allison's name still pricked her skin when she tried to sleep. At night, the city outside her window pulsed and the noise became a metronome she could not match. She sat at a window and watched late buses crawl like cold, tired animals. Her phone, that constant oracle, chimed with offers and reminders and one short message that had not come, a simple, "Come by tonight?" The absence of that casual invitation made the whole look bigger. She felt the horizon of her ambition tilt. Accepting the campaign would be the fulfillment of a promise she had made to herself years ago, the cresting peak of her career plan. Rejecting it would be an act of solidarity, a declaration that some things were larger than an image. There were no easy answers. The press was merciless in its own way. The photographers who had been patient with the benign angles now hungered for speculation. They began to stalk the peripheries, the address where Chelsea had been photographed walking into a cafe weeks before the abduction, the school district boundaries where Danny's daughter went to school. A minor someone who sold exclusive tidbits to the tabloids claimed to have seen Chelsea at a market, furtive, wearing a hat. The photograph was grainy, as if taken by someone who wanted to pretend to be unreadable. Chelsea, whose days had recently been full of the quiet work of therapy and rest, saw her privacy weaponized into marketable gossip. It was an assault that felt less physical than corrosive. Privacy, she realized, was not merely the absence of cameras but the ability to shape the terms by which your story could be told. She wanted control. The world around her offered only narratives, and so the decision came like the closing of a door. Chelsea finalized logistics with Danny and a trusted attorney. They found a place in a small town where light came with the scent of trees and where neighbors were unlikely to recognize a face from a magazine. She removed her images from public profiles. She ceased the polite rituals of fame award shows, interviews, the smile that is sold to sell everything else. For Chelsea, this withdrawal was not surrender so much as a reclamation of the self. She was stepping off a platform that could not be replaced with anything but the quiet acts of repair, therapy, careful sleep, the slow remapping of what trust meant. She wanted to be alive without the industry's instruments making her into a commodity. For Kat, the retreat presented not relief but an aching question. She understood why Chelsea needed to go, and she felt, with a kind of betrayal that was both selfish and tender, that the scaffolding of her life had been removed. The future they had sketched together, joint lines, co-branded philanthropy, shared manager calls, felt incomplete. She could no longer ask Chelsea's counsel in the hallway between fittings. She could not text a photograph and know whether Chelsea would laugh. There was an isolation that came from that absence that no amount of work could fill. Nicole's divorce closed in a different register. She signed the papers, walked away from the house with a small suitcase and keys to a smaller apartment where sunlight hit a thin kitchen counter just right. The price of speed had been relinquishment, and sometimes that left a hollow like missing teeth, but the relief from being continually tracked, from having to walk through doorways where old arguments had been staged, was immediate and clean. Leslie, whoever she was, an echo in Ted's sentences, possibly a co-conspirator in emotional betrayal, receded with the finality of signatures. Nicole found that what she had been wanting was not retribution but distance, and in that distance she began to piece together what a life without Ted might look like: rental agreements, a new route to work, the private pleasure of baking something that only she would eat. As Chelsea pulled away and Nicole closed a chapter, the industry continued to hum. People speculated, offers accumulated like snow, and Allison's name was a notation in legal documents. But human stories are never tidy. The scars of what had happened did not obey the timeline of courtrooms. and the decisions people made in response to trauma rippled outward into other lives. Kat's choice loomed like an approaching tide. The campaign she had been offered waited for her signature. Danny's gentle insistence on rest battled with the hunger she felt for the adrenaline of a life on the runway. Chelsea, in a house that smelled like pine and lemon, did therapy and learned how to fold her life carefully around new boundaries. When she left the city, Chelsea did so with a small suitcase and a few people who were loyal in the ways that did not ask for pictures. She closed a door, not the dramatic slam that makes headlines, but the slow, careful closing of an everyday hinge. The absence of cameras was sharp at first. Her hands, unaccustomed to the quiet, made little mistakes like leaving lights on. There was relief in the trivia of domesticity, a cup that warmed in her hands, a dog who answered to her soft whistle, a meal she cooked and eaten without comment. It was not the story the world wanted because the world preferred spectacle, a comeback, a breakdown, a dramatic reveal, but it was a necessary part of being someone who had been reformed by trauma and needed to learn how to be durable again. But endings had a way of being both final and provisional. Allison would be punished by law, Chelsea would, for a time, step away. Nicole would sign her papers. Yet none of these measures promised closure. The shadows of the event stretched into the future like a stain waiting to be scrubbed. In the final light of the first long stretch of days, the question that still sat everywhere was not who would be punished financially or legally, but how each woman would locate power again in forgiveness, in career, in small acts of domestic reclamation, or in the hard, lonely work of rebuilding an interior life people could no longer photograph. Kat received what might have been the defining call on a cold Friday morning. Her phone buzzed with an email that was half proposition, half plea. She read it 3 times on the subway, watching people who were oblivious to the tremors under the city. The campaign would be huge. The director was brilliant. The photographer's name alone could translate into offers that changed a career. She imagined the lights, the cameras, the high-octane presence of an industry machine that fed on visibility. She imagined these scenes without the person who had been her partner for so long. Her grip on the phone tightened. Then she thought of Chelsea's hands, the way they had trembled over a cup once, then steadied, and of Danny's voice saying, "Take your time, honey." She had to decide, and the decision was no longer simply about fashion or fame. It was about the terms under which she would go on representing a world that now felt like it had both given and taken too much. The camera lights were waiting for an answer. The city hummed. The women in the story moved through rooms of law offices, therapists' waiting areas, and quiet country houses. They had choices looming like doors, unmarked and heavy. One thing was certain, nothing would look the same when they reopened those doors.